Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the PNSO Podcast. I am Dennis Amando, Vice President for Engagement of the Pacific Nursing Service Organization. And today we are truly honored to launch this podcast as part of our celebration of Filipino Nursing Diaspora Day 2026. Today's conversation is especially meaningful because we are joined by one of the respected voices in the global Filipino nursing community, Dr. Jed Montayre. He is the president of the Filipino Nursing Diaspora Network, or the FIND Network. Dr. Jed, welcome to the PNSO Podcast. It is a privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Jed. And also, we are excited for this discussion because today it's not only about recognizing Filipino nurses across different countries, it's also about highlighting leadership, service, resilience, and the global impact of the Filipino nursing profession. So, let us begin with the significance of today's celebration. What does Filipino Nursing Diaspora Day personally mean to you?
Thank you, Dennis. So for me, Filipino Nursing Diaspora Day is both a celebration and a statement. So when we talk about as what I mean by being a celebration, it's something that we celebrate the extraordinary contribution of Filipino nurses across the world. It's also a recognition of defining the reality in Philippine nursing. So to me, the word diaspora reflects both our strength and our story. It speaks to the world-class quality of Filipino nursing education, but it's also speak about the fact that many Filipinos have had to seek opportunities abroad because those opportunities were not always available at home. So, but what stands out to me most is this. Filipino nurses have transformed that reality, those sacrifices that they had, into global impact. So when we talk about Filipino nursing diaspora, these dynamics, those things, to me, is really worth honoring.
Wow, that's very meaningful. I think one thing many people may not fully realize is the scale of Filipino nursing contributions globally.
Mm.
Why is it important to intentionally recognize and celebrate Filipino nurses working around the world?
So I think because Filipino nurses are making a global contribution, so that contribution deserves global recognition, right? So their presence across healthcare systems around the world is actually, it reflects the competence, the resilience, and the profound commitment to serve. So Filipino nurses have navigated challenges around migration, adapting to the new country, the new healthcare systems, as well as the professional challenges. So these things, they're actually contributing to deliver excellent care and lead with integrity. So that global impact really is very important, and I think we need to recognize that. And this has contributed to a lot of economies, a lot of healthcare systems in providing safe and effective care.
Yeah, indeed. The message basically is about global impact and empowerment.
Hmm.
And when we talk about an empowered Filipino nurse today, what does that look like in practice?
So when we talk about empowered nurses or empowerment, to me, an empowered nurse is a nurse who is supported, respected, and able to perform at their highest potential. So that means someone who is well in themselves, able to care for their own health and well-being. And when I'm talking about Filipino migrant nurses, this is very important because most of them, if not the majority, is actually living or separated from their families. Some people might be like, some nurses might be with their families in their host countries, but a lot of Filipino nurses are actually left their families behind. So that is something that is really important, to be empowered in a way that they're in terms of their own health and well-being, they're able to support their family, and they're able to work with confidence and purpose. So, I mean, professionally, it means being trusted, being heard, being given the resources and the opportunity to practice fully and safely. So sometimes, most of the times, Dennis, when we talk about empowerment, it is like we say it in a way that I feel empowered, right? So it's like in most cases we consider it as a feeling. But empowerment is not just feelings. It's a result of systems, leaderships, and cultures that allows nurses or Filipino nurses to thrive where they work.
Yeah, that's great. So what you're saying here is the empowerment of today goes beyond clinical excellence.
Mm,
So, and we're also seeing nurse leaders, empowered nurse leaders who are going into areas of leadership, policy influence, research, and even representation in decision-making process.
mm, mm.
So a lot of things have been happening, a lot of things that have been achieved by Filipino nurses. So maybe my question is, when you reflect on Filipino nurses globally, across hospitals, universities, research institutions, communities, what
Mm.
makes you most proud?
Yeah, I think this is a yeah, very good question because I mean, as a Filipino nurse myself, I've been trained in the Philippines. What makes me really proud about being a Filipino nurse or Philippine nursing or Filipino nurses in general is the consistency of Filipino nurses. It's wherever they are in the world, they are very adaptable. We are very hardworking and very deeply committed to the high standards of care. So, most of migrant nursing stories, they enter an unfamiliar system. They adjust quickly and they contribute to those healthcare systems. So it's not just about filling roles of whatever they're doing as a bedside, in clinical care, in education, or in research. It's not just about filling those roles, but it's actually strengthening the healthcare system itself. So, that capacity to succeed across different countries, cultures, and setting is something I believe deserves a real recognition and pride. And I'm very proud to hear these things from patients, from fellow nurses as well, even from doctors, when they ask me things like, oh, were you trained in the Philippines or are you a Filipino nurse? I've known Filipino nurses in the UK or in the US. They're very good bunch of nurses, like really competent in that. So I think that consistency across the globe really makes me proud of being a Filipino nurse.
Wow, those reflections are really profound and they really highlight how Filipino nurses continue to shape healthcare systems across
Mm,
borders.
mm.
And now we're moving towards the discussion on global presence. You have mentioned earlier that Filipino nurses are present in many healthcare systems worldwide.
Mm.
From your perspective, what makes Filipino nurses highly respected internationally?
I think it's the value that we bring to the table. So as I've mentioned earlier, the character, the attitude, and the values that that's embedded in our culture as Filipinos. But I think the most significant contribution is because Philippine nurses are really hardworking. When they do offer something, or when they actually, commit to the role or to the service, they're actually giving their heart to it. So I think that's really important to recognize that in a profession that's quite physically demanding, it actually can be emotionally and mentally exhausting at times. This is a really important factor that you really love your job and you're doing it because you're inspired to do better. You're inspired to provide for your families. Those factors really impact on how you perform. So global contribution in that sense is really driven. There's an internal motivation. And one observation that I've also have seen over the years, Filipino nurses are also very keen to develop themselves professionally.
Mhm.
So we've seen a lot of nurses, they go to another country or overseas. They started working in clinical practice or in clinical areas, but in a matter of 2 3 years, they started studying, pursuing their postgraduate degrees. They do master's degree or even doing doctorate degrees, and eventually lead to another pathway of in education or in research or even in policy. So I think this kind of characteristics plus the willingness and the motivation actually is a very good combination of how they can fully contribute to a particular region or country or to a healthcare system.
Yeah, I agree with what you've said, particularly on the value and character. And I also would like to add that, yeah, basically compassion, adaptability, These are also qualities that people consistently associate with Filipino nurses.
Mm.
But beyond bedside care, many Filipino nurses are now taking on expanded roles in leadership, in education, in research, and in policy. How do
Mm.
you see these evolving roles today?
So certainly, I mean, I have met Filipino nurses who are leading in education in universities. Also, many who are actually developing or driving staff development in hospital clinical teaching, as what you've mentioned, Dennis. So I've seen Filipino nurses in advanced practice roles as well, and in all of these leadership positions. So what it means is actually, these are not isolated examples. Like, these are not like only a trend in the US or in Australia or in Europe. These are evidence of a profession that is evolving, and the Filipino nurses are actively leading or contributing to that evolution. So it also speaks volume about our adaptability, our ability to actually learn from the current context where we're working, and actually understanding the intricate healthcare systems that we work with. Because these things, for example, Filipino nurses who are now nurse practitioners or advanced practitioners. That requires a lot of preparation. They have to do further education. At the same time, understanding the population that they serve, the trends in terms of the conditions or the diseases in the communities that they're dealing with, and all of that. So it's quite complex. So as these roles evolve, Filipino nurses are becoming more adaptable to this and are actually leading the evolution of these roles in the profession. So yes, that's probably how I can see these things evolving.
That's a very good discussion, and your insights really are worth looking into. For example, especially on the expanded and evolving roles. But we
Mm.
also know that there are many migrant and internationally educated nurses that still face significant challenges. From your experience, from what you have known, can you share with us some continuing realities or barriers that are experienced by Filipino nurses in the diaspora?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, when we talk about Filipino nurses, um, or migrant Filipino nurses, or in the diaspora, I mean, there's different levels of challenges. One level is personal challenges. So many Filipino nurses, as I've mentioned earlier, they continue to carry the emotional costs of immigration. So being separated from family, missing important events or moments. They build their lives far away from their loved ones. Like, these are really, really personal challenges that every migrant nurse has experienced or having, like, challenge for them. Professionally, one of the most persistent issues, and in my observation, is the under recognition of prior experience. And what I mean by this is, like, many Filipino nurses arrive in a country or in a region with years of clinical expertise. In some cases, they have leadership experience, yet they're often required to restart at an entry level. Of course, adapting to a healthcare system is necessary. No question around that. You have to learn. It's a new system. It's a new place, culture. You have to learn all of those. But at one point, we need to ask the difficult questions about fairness and equity and the consistency of these processes. I often ask the question, like, why is that previous experience why is those previous experience more readily recognized in some groups than in others? So that is not just a workforce issue. This is not just a migrant nurse kind of challenge, but this is an issue of justice and professional respect. So I think that's really important that we need to talk about this openly. For nurses who are quite experienced, or Filipino nurses who are quite experienced, what is the sort of recognition when they go to another place or another country in terms of what they previously had in their roles, either in leadership, in research, or whatsoever, and how can we actually promote that, as they start their journey in a different country or in a different context.
Wow. Those are very good points, particularly what you have said about justice and professional respect. Those are the parts on the professional side of nursing. Just a follow-up question. Do you think the healthcare systems globally are doing enough support to the nurses? Not just on the professional side, but also socially and emotionally.
Yeah, I think that's it varies. I think from a healthcare organization's point of view, when a country or a region actually are recruiting overseas trained nurses, I mean they have the responsibility to ensure that the nurses are they settle well, and they have packages, they have support and all of
Mhm.
that. But what I'm saying here is healthcare organization need to move beyond basic orientation, and take much more of a strategic approach to integration. So what that means is supporting migrant nurses, providing structured mentorship, cultural support. What I mean by that is, not just the culture of the country or the place, but actually the organizational culture, career development, and those practical assistance like social, as you mentioned, social aspects, settling into a new system and into a new society. So, if organizations are really serious about the sustainability of the workforce, especially when they're recruiting overseas trained nurses, they need to be really looking into workforce inclusion. So, and that would mean, the nurses that they've been recruiting who are trained overseas are, they become comfortable with the work culture, with their colleagues, and eventually give them the information, the resources, like where to go when they seek this, because it's not just about work. When you go to another country, you work to a hospital or whatever, but you also outside your 8-hour shift or 12-hour shift, then you have your own family, you have your personal life. So where are the support coming from, and what are the healthcare organizations normally, or the employer actually normal, what do they normally do in order for you to fulfill those needs? So I think migrant nurses should not just simply be recruited, they should be supported to succeed, to progress, and eventually, most importantly, to belong.
Yeah, I agree really. And I also agree with what you said that it's not just about work, but also about the community. Because another important part of the diaspora experience basically is the community. So how do you think, how important are Filipino communities and professional organizations in helping nurses succeed abroad?
Thanks, Dennis. I think community is really important. It's essential. For many migrant nurses, community provides the sense of belongingness. So they belong. It also provides them reassurance. At the same time, that solidarity, that makes life overseas sustainable. It helps address the social and the emotional realities of immigration. So for most migrant immigrants, or for migrant nurses, these communities actually, they actually create a space for them where they are understood without having to explain themselves.
Yeah.
So importantly, community is not just about comfort, it's about the strength, having that confidence that there's people who can readily understand your language, your culture. So for nurses, it actually is a very good way or platform for support. It's a support network that they need to endure, grow, and to flourish. And you have seen this in many, many, instances where someone probably have been working in a place when the community is not so strong, and
Mhm.
they probably would leave and go to another state. And one of the reasons, when you ask them, they would say that, oh, I'll go to Sydney because there's a lot of Filipinos in there, or I'll go to this country or state because I've heard that there are a lot of Filipino activities, or Filipino events where I can enjoy and participate. So community is really important.
Yeah, yes, community is really important. And that discussion basically is a very good segue to the things that we will be talking about next,
Mhm.
particularly on the Find Network and the importance of leadership and connection among Filipino nurses globally. So
Mm.
for the listeners who may not be familiar with it yet, can you briefly share the vision and mission of the Find Network?
So in a nutshell, so Find Network, so it's a network, it's a global network, and Find Network exists in order to bring Filipino nurses together across borders and across different career stages. So it creates a platform for connection, support, and professional engagement, and also our shared identity as nurses in the diaspora. So this is a, to me, Find Network is a platform, a very useful platform that where nurses can actually connect with each other and eventually share wisdom, um, discuss things that they want to work together, collaborate, and eventually also looking after each other, the well-being of how nurses are doing in this particular region in the world. And Find Network provides that platform, that conduit in order for this to happen. So we want Filipino nurses to know that they are not navigating this journey on their own. Through Find, we strengthen not only the professional network, but also the sense of unity and solidarity that comes from being part of a global Filipino nursing community. So I think that's how I would like our listeners to for those who are not familiar with Find, we are here as a network that supports, that connects, and of course, encourage nurses, Filipino nurses globally, to work together for a common goal, and at the same time sharing the wisdom, our shared identity, moving Filipino nursing forward, moving the profession forward.
Yeah, thank you. And based on what you have said, indeed, the Find Network really plays a very good role in connecting Filipino nurses across countries and regions, and it needs leadership. And in today's discussion, leadership is also coming out as a major theme for today's episode.
Mm.
Why do you think is leadership development especially important among Filipino nurses today?
I think, you know, leadership development is really critical because, I mean, with Filipino nurses located globally, our potential to contribute to healthcare systems in terms of nursing leadership is also something that would be really really important or significant in terms of power, in terms of say numbers, because there's so many. So
Mhm.
there is the high potential to it. Now, leadership development is important because, to me, it must be developed intentionally. Okay, I do not subscribe to the idea that leaders are simply born.
Mhm.
Leaders are built through experience. We reflect about being a leader. We learn, and there is discipline. So for Filipino nurses, that means you need to seek mentors, you need to develop your leadership skills. And of course, the landscape of healthcare system has rapidly changed. Technology, the complexities of our of the patients that we're looking after, the research that we're dealing with, it has changed tremendously. So leadership is really really important. And if Filipino nurses are located globally, they have this potential to contribute, they'll actively contribute in nursing leadership that moves forward the vision of their healthcare organizations, or the healthcare systems where they're currently practicing.
Yeah, you mentioned about potential to lead, but at some point we feel and we also observe that there are those who have potential to lead, but they are not leading.
Yeah.
Uh, do you think that Filipino nurses sometimes underestimate their capacity to lead globally?
Yes, I do. I think it is a very this is a really good question and a very important issue. So many Filipino nurses we go into a new environment with humility. We are cautious,
Mhm.
and a very strong desire to adopt. But sometimes that humility can also be self-silencing. You know what I mean? So they may hesitate to speak up, question themselves, or assume that others are more entitled to lead the conversation. So, these kind of things can be shaped by culture, by unfamiliarity, or by past experiences of being overlooked. But the truth is, I think, Filipino nurses really bring bring rich experience. They have sound judgment, and of course the value, the character that we bring. So to me, this is not the challenge is not lack of contribution. It is that too many still underestimate the significance of what they already bring. So that something needs to be internally, there needs to be some motivation, some kind of, we need to empower and actually get people to believe in themselves and what they bring to the table. So, it is a fact that a lot who've got potential may tend not to lead or not to be engaged more actively in leadership roles. But I think it's a matter of like self-reflection and saying, I've been in this healthcare organization for a very long time. I know the system, I know the people, I know the job really, really well. Where can I contribute? And I think that's a very important motivator or driver for nurses or Filipino nurses to start, thinking about leadership.
Thanks, Jed. What I'm getting from what you have said is basically we have to be very intentional in
Mm,
developing our leadership capacities and
mm,
in really identifying our niche where we can lead.
correct.
And it's very helpful also for the younger generation of nurses. And yeah, for those young Filipino nurses listening today, particularly students and early career
Mm.
professionals, what advice would you give to those aspiring to become future leaders?
So yeah, that's right. So as I mentioned earlier, leadership is intentional. Like it has to be developed intentionally. So for younger Filipino nurses, for younger nurses, what it means is you seek leadership development programs. You need to be seeking strong mentors. So mentors who will be able to help you, be your sponsor, to people who have seen the potential in you, and pursuing development opportunities, as I've mentioned. So understanding that the wider direction of the profession is really important. So sometimes when we are, for example, working in a particular ward or one university or one unit, we are really, of course, very focused on what we do day to day jobs or tasks that we're doing. But you need to have a more wider perspective of the direction of the trend. Look at the technology. How is it shaping healthcare? And as a nurse leader in the future, how would you contribute to that direction around using digital technologies and AI in healthcare? And where do you see yourself as a nurse in the future? So that's really, really important to have that wider perspective. And of course, it's important to be connected with people who are able to share and inspire you. Learn about the successes, the mistakes of those who came before us or before
Yeah.
them. So it's really, really important. So leadership begins long before the title, long before you become to that level of being a chief nurse or a chief researcher or a national scientist. It actually begins long before that. It begins with your mindset, your preparation, and of course, the driver and the willingness to step forward when needed.
Yeah, you mentioned about mentorship already and basically the importance of mentorship in nursing. Um, and the need for the experienced nurses to better support the next generation. Those are really good ideas, and those are the things that we should be thinking about as we develop our future leaders. And yeah, we're finally moving to the final segment of the discussion, and I want to focus on the future, where nursing is heading and what
Mm.
opportunities Filipino nurses should prepare for moving forward. So looking ahead, let's say in the next 5 to 10 years, what kind of future would you like to see for Filipino nurses globally?
So I think for me, as I see it now, and I think my vision for the future, I want to see Filipino nurses to be more visible, more influential, and more represented in leadership across clinical care, education, research, and policy. So we have the capability, we have the world class nursing education and preparation. And of course, there is that commitment. For many, many examples out there, you can see that strong commitment to lead. So Filipino nurses have been long been very essential to healthcare delivery. So the future must include Filipino nurses to be recognized, to be part of the future of nursing in shaping healthcare itself. So I want to see Filipino nurses recognized not only for their service, but for their leadership. I think that's my greatest or strongest message in here. So, we nursing as a profession is no longer confined to the traditional expectations of just, like how it's portrayed as providing bedside care or in the hospital. It has expanded so much and has gone a long way in terms of practice. And with the Filipino nurses' potential being located globally, as you said, a global Filipino nurse, there is that possibilities in there. So really looking forward or looking into more leadership, more influence in policy and practice.
Yeah, so yeah, more influence in policy and practice and going beyond bedside care.
Mm,
And what do you think are other opportunities for Filipino nurses that they should begin exploring more
mm.
actively? So aside from moving beyond the bedside care.
Mm, mm. So I think one of the things that we're seeing now as a trend is we're seeing a lot of Filipino nurses who are in educator roles or research related roles. So they become professors in universities. They lead research programs. Not just really solely focus on nursing, but actually health programs, like health research programs. So I think that is very promising and very reassuring to see this happening, because that actually proves the way, like, as nurses or nursing professional or Filipino nurses, we can actually lead an interdisciplinary team, and with putting your values, your character as a Filipino nurse to it, the training that you've had, I think that's worth exploring. The other area that I also the most, like, really important that we need to be more to keep an eye on is nurses influencing policies. I think this is an important time for us to have a voice in the policy making tables. So, there's a really good great nurse leaders out there, very prominent in the work in terms of research, in terms of education, or even in clinical practice. But see, these things, we can only see change when it is promoted or advocated through policy. So it is very important that we are quite aware of the policy making process. How do we influence policy? We need to navigate healthcare policies and systems so that we have a voice in these discussions. So it's important for nurses to, if there is a submission about a particular policy change, that as a nursing organization or a peak body, nurses will have a submission or should have a voice to say, this is what nurses think in terms of this policy change, or this is what nurses think in terms of supporting or advocating to that policy change that has been proposed. So those things. And the other thing, last thing, I think, Dennis, for me, is we need to explore how nurses can be more actively contributing towards the use of technology. So technology, AI, is shaping the healthcare system, the context where we're working right now, rapidly. So I think there is a lot of opportunities for our nurses to become, technology leaders in terms of advocating for digital health, use of these technologies in healthcare, so that when the time comes when we are so very sophisticated with regards to the use of these resources, then nurses are there, nurses are ready, and there's someone out there, a nurse leader, who are able to navigate and share the wisdom around these things, particularly for technology related issues.
Yeah, thank you. And you have also mentioned a lot of opportunities for nurses, not only for for the nurses in the future, particularly in the leadership position, in
Mm,
research, in policy. But we also know that there are many challenges that face healthcare systems globally.
mm.
Having said that, what gives you hope about the future of nursing?
Well, I'm quite optimistic. I mean, people always say I'm a very optimistic person. But what gives me hope is that nursing continues to expand in influence. In sophistication. You're getting sophisticated, and we're seeing impact. So, as I've mentioned earlier, we are no longer defined or confined. The profession is no longer confined to traditional expectations. Nurses are now leading in research, innovation. We have advanced practitioners, digital health, all of those systems improvement and policy. But what is especially encouraging is the new generation of nurses, Dennis. I think, nurses are now very evidence driven. We are confident, and they're willing to challenge outdated practices to improve care. I think that's really, really important. So that tells me that the future of nursing is not only secure, but it is full of possibilities. So that gives me hope. And as a teacher, as a professor, I see my students when they develop this critical thinking, their ability to scientifically challenge practice, and not just challenge but provide or propose solutions to issues in practice. I think that gives me a lot of hope of where nursing is leading and the possibilities that we have.
Wow. So optimistic, secure, full of possibilities. Very insightful discussion, Jed. And before we finally end this, if you could share one message with the Filipino nurses around the world today, what would it be?
Okay, so my message would be continue to lift one another. Continue to empower one another. You share your successes, generously, so that others may be inspired by them. Also, share your struggles honestly so that others may learn from them. So, and you never lose sight of the fact that when Filipino nurses support Filipino nurses, we strengthen not only individuals, but the whole profession. So I think as a key takeaway message, I'd say our collective progress depends on our willingness to rise together. So that's just it's a long message, but to me, it's just empower each other, lift each other, and actually, collective progress really depends on how we support each other.
Yeah, so very insightful, very interesting discussion. And finally, one question before we close. Dr. Jad, please complete the sentence. Filipino nurses around the world are?
World class, phenomenal, and future leaders.
Great. Thank you very much, Jed, for joining us in this inaugural episode of the PNSO Podcast and for your inspiring leadership and advocacy for Filipino nurses worldwide. And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us as we celebrate Filipino Nursing Diaspora Day 2026. Today, we honor the dedication, compassion, resilience, leadership, and global contributions of Filipino nurses across borders and across generations. May this conversation remind us that Filipino nurses are not only essential members of the healthcare workforce, they are also leaders, innovators, educators, advocates, and change makers, and a lot more that shape healthcare systems around the world. This has been Dennis Amando for the PNSO Podcast. Maraming salamat at mabuhay ang Filipino nurses.